So that brings us to chapter 7, where we begin our quest to the hair follicle, and we'll primarily be talking about hair biology in chapter 7, and then in chapter 8 we will actually talk more about the mature hair shaft. So in this chapter, we'll briefly discuss the hair follicle, also the hair growth cycle. There's 3 different principal hair growth cycles. And then we'll talk a little bit about androgenic alopecia or alopecia, and also about hair graying. So these last 2 items are 2 very important issues within sociological circles or within the general public that are a result of some type of dysfunction in hair biology. So the hair follicle, it's actually it's often called an organ in the human body. And, it's a very metabolically active area. And for this reason, these hair cells types produce very rapidly, and this is one of the reasons why people that undergo chemotherapy treatments lose their hair, is because chemotherapy actually targets cells that are that divide very rapidly. Cancer cells are like this, and also the hair follicle. The cells that are associated with the hair follicle can also be characterized as this, and for that reason, they become targets of the chemotherapy as well. There are about 20 different cell populations in the hair follicle, and they undergo a process of regeneration that basically controls the production of the hair fiber, and that's what I'm referring to as the hair shaft. The hair shaft is actually the mature hair. It's sort of what we know as the dead hair, for lack of a better term, and that's the whole function of this incredible machinery is to produce a mature hair shaft. In general, generally speaking, there are about 5 million hair follicles located all over the body. Just roughly, there's a certain percentage here, 80,000 to 150,000 are located on the scalp. That's pretty much the most dense area of hair growth. And of all these hair fibers, 90 to 95% are in what's known as the growth stage or the growing stage, and 5 to 10% are actually in a resting stage. And you'll see what I mean by that when we talk about the hair growth cycles. So the scalp hair grows at about 0.3 to 0.4 millimeters per day. So you can sort of figure out, if you shaved your head, how many days it would take you to grow it back to a substantial length. Another important item to know about hair follicles is that you're born with all the hair follicles you have at birth, so you do not produce any more after birth. So as you can imagine, the density of hair follicles on the skin is much greater at birth or when you're an infant than later in life, because as you grow, the density of the hair follicles will then decrease. We also find that in the hair follicle region, there are a lot of different factors that influence this area, and these include things that we talked about already during the semester, such as cytokines, hormones, neurotransmitters, enzymes, transcription factors, and all of these things, work in concert to basically, as we mentioned here in this bullet item, orchestrate the function of the hair follicle. Hair loss, which again we're going to talk about in this chapter a little bit, it affects roughly 40% of men and 20% of women that are over the age of 50. And in general, we lose about 50 to 150 hair fibers each day. So this is the hair follicle structure. This is a very simple diagram. I'm going to show you increasingly complex diagrams in the next few slides. But this one just gives you a general idea of, this is the hair follicle. This region down here is known as the bulb of the fiber. You can see here, this is these little cells that are drawn here. These are matrix cells. These are actually cells that divide and they produce the mature hair shaft. So that's very important. And then we have the dermal papaya that's marked here. And again, we mentioned that before when we were talking about the dermis and the epidermis, how you would have like these finger-like projections in the skin, and we called them papilla. Here we have, this papilla actually forms into the hair fiber structure or the hair follicle structure. Here we also have two important parts that we're going to talk about. You can see this sort of dark line that outlines the fiber here, or the follicle. This is known as the inner root sheath. And essentially it's like this covers, this forms part of the hair follicle and actually provides a covering for the mature hair shaft that's made. Mind you, the hair shaft is starting to be made up in this region, or this is where it starts to really form. So this forms a coating, or sort of I don't really want to say an encapsulation, but maybe a coating is the best word for right now. And then outside of that, you have another area that's known as the outer root sheath. And again, we'll go into a little bit more detail with those in a second. We also have collagen fibers that are present, and they're drawn here. You can see you have ones that are parallel to the axis of the hair fiber, and ones that are perpendicular that go across and around. Actually, they go around the hair follicle, and these stabilize the hair follicle structure. They essentially provide a scaffold or structure for the hair follicle within the skin. So this is, if we look at the hair follicle a little bit closer up, essentially you can break it down into different regions. Again, I mentioned the bulb region. That's at the very base of the hair follicle. Then you have a suprabular region, which is just above the bulb, and this is followed by this isthmus region that's shown here, and then infundibulum region, which is this uppermost part of the follicle. And the isthmus region is actually, you can see here, this is a sebaceous gland. This is a light microscope image of the hair follicle that was stained with a biological dye. So you can see, this sort of red, little bit purplish color here. This is all due to the hair follicle. You can vaguely see the sebaceous gland that's shown here. These are two additional images that are shown here, and again, this is just to give you a histological perspective of the hair follicle. Essentially, this is really nice because you can see inside here, HS, this stands for the hair shaft. So you can see this is the mature hair fiber that I was talking about that's being produced by the hair follicle. Here we have the inner root sheath. Again, this is like an envelope providing stability and structure around the hair shaft. And then we have the outer root sheath, which is this zone over here. So again, it's all along here. It's the outer root sheath. Then we have outside of the outer root sheath, we have another layer out here. This is known as the basement membrane. Okay. I think, yeah, over here we have the connective tissue root sheath actually is shown. This is the outermost structure. So this helps all of the hair follicle be embedded into the skin. All these different layers are important in hair biology, but ultimately, you know, what we are producing is this hair shaft, which is what eventually emerges from the skin. Over here this is just this erector pili muscle that we talked about before earlier in the semester. This is connected to the hair follicle unit. Again, this sort of changes tension, sometimes due to different reasons, but for example, if you get cold, when you have goosebumps, that's caused by flexing of this muscle. This isn't something that we control. This is an uncontrolled process. And then over here we have, you know, so we're looking at a cross section of this whole area. This is a cross section of a sebaceous gland. Down below in the lower region of the bulb, so this is a little bit in the mid region there, so that's going, you know, that's up in this region over here. Down in this bottom region, in the bulb region, you can see you have Dermal Papaya, which is shown here, which we already mentioned. Here you can see sort of this coating of the connective tissue root sheath that's shown here. And then here we have M, this is indicating melanocytes. It's showing you here, they're also on this side. They produce melanin granules that are then deposited into the mature hair fiber eventually. Over here is just a diagram of all those things. It's not the most correct diagram because, you know, it shows like single cell layers for everything, but they're not really single cell layers in all cases. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. For example, you know, where it says medulla, cortex, hair cuticle, you know, this is supposed to be the hair shaft. These aren't single cell layers. These are multiple cell layers. They're actually, you know, these are entirely different morphological components. But just to give you a general idea, the hair shaft is in here, composed of a hair cuticle, cortex, and medulla. Then we have the inner root sheath, cuticle. Again, the inner root sheath section is actually combined of, there's three principal components. Sometimes you'll see four, but the three principal components are the inner root sheath cuticle, Huxley's layer, Henle's layer, and sometimes you'll see the companion layer listed there as well. The outer root sheath is this one that's shown here. You can see it listed, it's sort of labeled over here. And then the connective tissue root sheath is this most outer part of the hair follicle. We have the dermal papaya here that you can see. And then we have the matrix cells that are shown where I'm highlighting with the mouse right now. And again, the matrix cells are responsible for producing the differentiated cells that form the mature hair shaft. So when we talk about hair, okay, we can talk about the anagen bulb. Anagen is one of the growth cycles of the hair, and anagen is pretty much the state where the hair is growing. And again, it is the hair follicle is one of the most rapidly dividing tissues in the body. So it contains these proliferating matrix keratinocytes. So the matrix cells are keratinocytes, just like keratinocytes in the epidermis, only this time, you know, they're producing hair cells or it's producing a hair fiber. So it's a little bit different. But they're still keratinocytes and they're matrix matrix cell keratinocytes. Again, these move upwards and they differentiate into the hair shaft and also into the inner root sheath. So they form both of those parts. The melanocytes that we talked about, these transfer melanin, the pigment, into the keratinocytes as they're developing, and this provides the hair with its pigmentation or color. And these cells are supplied by pluripotent stem cells that exist in the bulge, and we'll mention that, or we'll discuss that in just a moment. But again, you can see outlined the hair shaft again consists of, this is the mature hair fiber that consists of a medulla. The medulla is like a vacuolated or sort of almost empty region in the middle of the hair fiber. This is surrounded by the cortex, and then the cortex is surrounded by a cuticle. That all makes up the hair shaft. And then after that we have the inner root sheath that's composed of the IRS cuticle, Henle's layer, Huxley's layer, and then the companion layer you can see on this slide is sort of separate from the inner root sheath. That's how you should learn it. It should be separate from the inner root sheath. And then outside of the companion layer we have the outer root sheath. So the companion layer is sort of a boundary between the inner root sheath and the outer root sheath. Again, the dermal papilla is shown down here. The matrix cells are shown here. It's pointed on this side, but they're actually over here as well. The matrix cells are, if you look where I'm highlighting right now with the mouse key, right in that region. This region up here, the keratinizing zone, this is where the mature hair shaft is formed. And essentially this diagram over here pretty much gives you the same information that I just gave you. So talking about the bulge, we can go into this. The bulge region is basically part of the outer root sheath, and it's located just below a sebaceous gland. You can see it's right here in this region. Here's the erector pili muscle, and then the sebaceous gland would be somewhere up in here. So, these hair follicle stem cells are responsible for generating or regenerating the hair follicle in each cycle of growth. So you'll see that the hair undergoes all these different growth cycles. So something has to reproduce the hair follicle during these processes or cycles. Again, stem cells leave the bulge in the outer root sheath, and they actually migrate towards the matrix zone, and that's where they begin to proliferate and differentiate into new hair shafts. So you can see here these cells sort of migrate down along here into the region where the matrix cells are. Again, these are all the components that we already discussed on the previous slide. So just in general, you're going to have to know the structure of this and be able to draw an illustration of the hair follicle unit with all the different layers that are involved in that. So the dermal papilla, actually, this is considered to be a really important region of the hair follicle in terms of controlling or regulating hair growth, and also it plays a big role in determining the size of the hair bulb, also the hair shaft diameter, its length, and also the duration of the anagen phase of the hair growth cycle. So, again, you sort of refer to the dermal papilla as the conductor of the orchestra or the command center, and it's a source of a bunch of different growth factors that are very important for hair growth and melanogenesis. And melanogenesis is just a term that describes the synthesis of, or the process of the synthesis of melanin by the melanocytes. If you surgically remove dermal papilla, this essentially prevents hair growth. And what's actually been found in the literature, and it's I think pretty well known at this point, is that if you have dermal papilla cells that are obtained from someone that's bald, you'll find that there are higher levels of the androgen receptor, and also type 2,5-alpha reductase, which is an enzyme that converts testosterone to dihydroxytestosterone. So this might not mean that much to you right now. In a few slides, you'll see why this is relevant, because androgen is responsible for, this is a key responsible factor in hair loss. We also see that dihydroxytestosterone basically can induce dermal papilla cells to secrete factors such as transforming growth factor beta 1 and a couple of other factors as well. But essentially, the important part to know here is that it induces dermal papilla cells to secrete these factors that actually inhibit keratinocyte growth. So the hair growth cycle, we already mentioned anagen. This is the growth stage, or really the active growth stage. Then we have, catagen and telogen. And you can just look at this time scale here and see that, anagen is like 1,000 days roughly. And these are rough numbers. Catagen is 10 days, and then telogen is 100 days. And what happens during this process is that, you have this hair follicle. It basically is disjointed from the papilla, the dermal papilla region, and you can see you form what's known as this club hair. Okay, you can see the difference in the club hair from the normal hair here, and the club hair, changes shape when you go into telogen, and then when the follicle regenerates and you go back to the anagen phase, you can see that you have sort of a new club or a new follicle here, and then you have the old club hair that's shown here on the right, and this is what falls out, or that's what's shed as a fiber. So, just to give you a little bit of a better picture of this, we can start here at the top. We have here anagen. Again, this can be anywhere, we said 1,000 days. This can be anywhere from 2 to 6 years, depending on the individual and genetics and everything. You can see all of the things outlined here in this illustration. As you go from anagen to catagen, you can see the change where you can see the formation of this club hair that's shown here. You go into telogen, you can see the club hair is moving up into the upper portion of the hair follicle region. And then, it's showing you here that the club hair is essentially gone, and that's at that point you have a new hair forming, which is shown here. And then you continue through this whole cycle. So, most of the hair growth disorders, you have some type of disruption or disturbance of this hair follicle cycling, or the hair follicle cycle, and that's really the root of most hair growth disorders that we know of. And when you talk about things that affect this, you can think of external factors: air pollution, sunlight. If you have excessively dry skin, if you're in heated rooms or air-conditioned rooms, all year round, that can have an influence on that. And then also exposure to chemical substances. And in addition to that, you have, internal factors, which again,
genetically speaking, you could be predisposed to this, to losing, for hair loss. Aging processes occur, stress, metabolic disorders, also, disorders related to hormone and vitamin levels. You can have side effects of drugs or pharmaceuticals, and then also certain disease states in the skin can also influence this. So here we talk about hair loss, and we're just going to mention androgenic alopecia because this is the most common. This is the basically the most common hair loss that's caused by the amount of the hormone dihydroxytestosterone or dihydrotestosterone. I think that's misspelled on here. If you go back, actually I think on the next slide the correct spelling is there. But essentially what you observe with this is a reduction in the percentage of scalp hair follicles in anagen. So you also have a reduction in the anagen growth phase duration, so this becomes shorter in the cycle. And then you have an increase in the percentage of hair follicles that are intelligent, and you also have an increase in the duration of telogen. So basically you're changing the entire hair cycle process or normal timings and everything, and that's having a huge effect on the overall state of the hair or state of the scalp. And most of the therapeutic strategies for hair loss basically aim to inhibit catagen development, and they want to prolong the anagen phase. So they try to do this by inducing anagen in telogen follicles. That's probably the primary route, and or they try to inhibit exogen. So in males, there are several different types of male pattern alopecia. Up at the top, you can see you have type 1 in the non-bald state, then the initial stages and the late stages. Type 2, you can see that this top one, this is sort of known as the horseshoe type balding, which is clearly distinct there. In the type 2, you can see that when the balding starts, it starts in the front, but you also get this formation in the back, and this looks a little bit different in the end than the other one. Not so much of a horseshoe shape in this case. And then we have type 4 that's shown here, and you can see here that you have sort of this Willow's point here, where you have just this point coming out at you, and you have this sort of inward balding that occurs here. Also, you have balding in the crown region as well. At the end result, in the late stage of this, you would have something that looks like this shown on the right. And again, we mentioned that the androgens are, a key hormone that's responsible for this. And, these androgens are produced by the adrenal glands and the ovaries or the testes in males. And these hormones are transported in the bloodstream by transfer proteins. In this case, sex hormone binding globulin is the transport protein, and they bring it to other tissues in the body. And in this case, these are brought to pilosebaceous, or to the pilosebaceous unit, and then the hormones dissociate from the binding proteins, and that's when you have some activity occur. And in this case, testosterone is actually converted in the hair follicle to dihydroxytestosterone. And remember, we mentioned 5-alpha reductase before, is this enzyme responsible for this process.
And essentially, formation of dihydroxytestosterone is dangerous because that's what's responsible for altering the hair cycle. Okay. You can see here that these steroids act inside the keratinocytes to induce apoptosis, and it's not absolutely sure, but it's believed that this involves some sort of receptor protein, which is more than likely the case. So that's pretty much all we have for hair balding or hair loss. So let's just talk a little bit about hair graying. And pretty much hair graying, for the most part, correlates with chronological aging. So usually, if you look among different racial groups, the Caucasian group is usually the most susceptible to hair gray earliest in life. So they start actually in the mid-30s. Asians, it's maybe in the late 30s. And for Africans, it's in the mid-40s until they really start. And these are the average ages. Sometimes you'll see premature hair graying, and this can even occur before the age of 20 in whites, 25 in Asians, and 30 years in Africans. And about 50% of the population has 50% gray hair by the age of 50. So that's an interesting statistic. So in general, the hair graying process results from loss in the activity of the melanocytes. So you have less melanin being produced, and this pathway, melanogenesis, there's something that's not occurring in melanogenesis. It's not occurring at full potential, or it's not manufacturing melanin at full potential. And tyrosinase, as you'll recall, that's when we talked about the skin and melanin or melanocytes. We spoke about how tyrosinase was actually responsible for it. It's an enzyme in the pathway to produce melanin. And we already discussed this as well, that the melanocytes basically package melanin into these small organelles known as melanosomes. And you can have two different types of melanin present. You can have eumelanin, which is the brown-black pigment, or you could have pheomelanin, which is the red-yellow pigment. And melanin is transferred into the hair matrix cells, and these are incorporated into the hair shaft. So, remember, the matrix cells are dividing, just like it's kind of analogous to the basal cells of the epidermis. One stays behind, one becomes a differentiating cell. So in this case, the matrix cells, one would stay behind, another would become a differentiating cell, and it would contain melanin in it, and this is what is formed results in the formation of the hair shaft. In general, melanocyte activity and the number of melanocytes decline with age, and we see hair graying when the melanocytes are not able to populate or fill the follicle bulb with melanin. So this is just a illustration of hair graying, what it looks like in terms of the melanocyte activity or the amount of melanin present. So on the far left here, you have a fully pigmented hair fiber. And if you look at this diagram, you can see these things that we've already learned: outer root sheath, inner root sheath, the matrix cells, the dermal papaya, the basement membrane.
And then we have, these melanocytes that are shown here producing melanin. The melanin are these little circles that are shown. So we have lots of melanocytes here. This is where the dermal papilla is hidden. Okay, and it says no single melanocytes, meaning that we have a lot of melanocytes. We don't have like individual melanocytes spread throughout. So if we look at a hair shaft that's a little bit more lightened, you can see in the optical image that's shown here. This is with these images below were obtained with a microscope, and in this case, you start to see single melanocytes below what's known as the Auber's line. This line that's drawn across to each one of these, right in the middle of the bulb, this is known as the Auber's line. So in this case, you can see that there are single melanocytes below the line. Above the line, no, you can see there you have multiple melanocytes. So these two melanocytes that are drawn on this illustration are by themselves. So you're still producing melanin, not as much as you are in the first case. When we go a little bit more to something even lighter, at this point you can see that you have less melanocytes present, and this results in lower levels of melanin being produced. If we go to the case where we have even lighter hair, we only see fragmented pigments in the hair shaft. We can see single melanocytes present, here, not very many. And in this case, the dermal papilla is clearly visible. You can see that in the other cases, they're not, because it's basically covered with the melanin. It's being hidden by the melanin. And then in the last case, we have a hair shaft and bulb where there's no pigment, and in this case, you do not see visible melanocytes. So, you have these 5 stages that can occur in the hair graying process, from one extreme to the other. And that's why you have salt and pepper hair, or you have hair with various degrees of pigmentation. You have one fiber that's gray, one that's dark, one that's in between. So there are some theories to understanding, why does hair gray? I mean, what is the actual reason behind it? And one of the theories that has been proposed is the free radical theory of graying. Essentially, in the follicles of hair that are gray, they have a much lower activity in terms of the melanocytes. So, some of the other theories that have sort of come about is that there's some defect in the melanosome transfer in the graying, or in hair follicles of gray hair. You also see that melanocytes in graying and white hair bulbs are vacuolated. This is a typical cellular response to high levels of oxidative stress. We also see that there's an increased incidence of hair bulb melanocyte apoptosis in aged follicles. This could be indicative of some type of free radical process. You don't have oxidative stress protectors present in the follicles of gray hair fibers. 2 of them are BCL2 and c-KIT signaling. These are just 2 different proteins that are known as oxidative stress protectors, and we essentially see low levels of them in follicles of gray hair fibers. Another thing is that it's believed that possibly
as you age, you have higher levels of hydrogen peroxide, and this could have an effect on the melanin. This could actually oxidize it. If you look at hair bleaching, when you bleach hair, you use hydrogen peroxide and some other things. So it's thought that high levels of hydrogen peroxide, could affect this as well. And just as a note on that, usually hydrogen peroxide that's produced in the body is actually broken down by catalase, which is an antioxidant enzyme. And we see that there are, lower levels of this enzyme present with aging. There's also been proposals that oxidative stress could be generated outside of the hair follicle, and this could be due to inflammatory, or it could be due to inflammatory reasons, or also there was an article that sort of was looking at psycho-emotional roots that were causing that. So you can see over here that kind of summarizes it. Inflammation, UV light, they say cigarette smoke, psycho-emotional stress, chemicals, and genetic defects could all influence the production of melanin by the melanocytes.